So thank you very much for your time, Ambassador John Bolton. And today we wanted to speak about the war, about the new elected president of the United States of America. And my first question is, let me start from the question, are we any closer to the ending of the Russians' war against the Ukraine since Donald Trump was elected the president of the United States? Because we all know about his statement that he could finish this war for the 24 hours, but this war is not finished yet.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I don't think we really know any more today about what Trump has in mind as a possible settlement. As you point out, he didn't succeed in resolving it in the first 24 hours. Now he's saying between 3 months and 6 months, but that's really guesswork. Uh, I think that there's significant reason, though, for Ukraine to be concerned about the direction that these negotiations could take. And in part, if you look at what Trump said, not only during the campaign, but in the transition and in his first 10 days in office, it's a very strong sense that what he really wants is for the war in Ukraine to be behind him. I'd say the same about the war in the Middle East. He just doesn't want to have to worry about them. He said during the campaign these were Biden's wars. He said that had he been president, neither Ukraine nor the war in the Middle East would have taken place. And all of that implies that what Trump really wants is just to get the wars behind him, which also implies he doesn't care about the terms on which they're settled. And that's why I'm concerned that given Putin's ability to play with Trump in the first term, that he knows from his days in the KGB how to size people up and how to manipulate them. And I'm afraid that once the talks actually get started, that Putin will come off more successfully than President Zelensky, who's done a lot in the past several months to try and warm relations with Trump, but I don't think has really succeeded. Just one small piece of evidence: in the past few days, Putin has said publicly that Trump was right. That had he been president, there would not have been a war between Russia and Ukraine. So that's how you begin to flatter Trump. That's how you begin to work him, and I'm afraid, therefore, Putin has already started.
Yeah, and do you believe that Donald Trump and his administration really has a plan to stop the war, to resolve this conflict, or they just play the game because they wanted to make a deal? So he said before a lot of times that it wanted to make a deal, but it's not a real negotiations between the political objects. And do you believe that American side now have a real path to continue to support Ukraine and to resolve this war, resolve this bloody Russian war in positive way towards Ukraine?
Well, I'm afraid that Trump really doesn't have an idea in any strategic sense how he wants the war to end. For him, a deal is a deal. It's not part of a policy or a grand strategy. It's just one more transaction. It's like buying a piece of property in Manhattan and putting a building up on it. You do one, then you move on to the next one. And obviously, in the case of Ukraine, uh, President Zelensky has a very clear idea what he thinks the outcome ought to be for Ukraine. Putin has a very clear idea what he wants to be the outcome for Russia, and Trump doesn't really have an idea, except if what I said earlier is accurate, he wants the war to be over. And one of his advisors, who is now the envoy on resolving the war, Keith Kellogg, and others, wrote that the strategy they would employ would be to threaten Russia with more sanctions if they didn't agree to a deal, and threaten Ukraine with a cutoff of assistance if they didn't negotiate a deal. And I'm worried that with that sort of approach, it could get very difficult for Ukraine fairly quickly. Remember also that during the campaign, the now Vice President J.D. Vance said he could imagine a settlement where you would freeze the current front lines, the military front lines. That would become a new de facto border between Russia and Ukraine. You created the demilitarized zone there, and that Ukraine would agree not to join NATO. And Vance said that would be a settlement that he could accept. It's very hard to believe that he said that during the campaign without talking to Trump about it. Now, that kind of settlement you could have written in the Kremlin. So again, these are just bits and pieces. There's not enough evidence to be conclusive on, but it's evidence why I think there's good reason in Ukraine to worry.
It's very hard to believe that Ukraine accept the statements said by the J.D. Vance. But nevertheless, the future of the world in the context of Trump's statement and his first actions is really unpredictable. We can mention Greenland in this case. And is it possible to assume that Ukraine will again become a nuclear state if United States of America aid is reduced or stop altogether?
Well, it's very hard. It's very hard to draw conclusions from one or the other. But I think the statements Trump has made about Greenland and Panama not ruling out the use of force are very harmful to Ukraine. They're very harmful to Taiwan too, because we've said repeatedly that in Europe the use of force was unacceptable post World War II, and we've said to the Chinese the use of force against Taiwan is not acceptable. Now, Putin's already used force twice against Ukraine, and Taiwan remains vulnerable. And yet, the statements that Trump has made, you could imagine Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin making. So that's why I say, notwithstanding all of President Zelensky's efforts, and he has made many, many efforts with Trump, I think that Trump's desire to see his old friend Vladimir Putin again, his desire to just not have to deal with any of the problems that he sees in effect that Biden created and left for him, it probably indicates that it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to sustain its position in the negotiations. Of course, a lot depends on the Europeans, and we don't know really how they will behave.
Okay, so let's turn to the NATO and the possibilities of the NATO to help Ukraine, because without United States of America, NATO does not seem a very strong alliance. NATO and the possible configuration of international relations based on the new vision of international policy by the public administration, what could this lead to? Strengthening the NATO as a military and political bloc, or just erosion of this organization and, for example, creation a smallest one from the European countries? What do you think about the future of the NATO in this context?
Well, I'm very worried about that too. I've said before, and I still believe that ultimately Trump would like to withdraw the United States from NATO. He does not understand what a collective defense alliance is. In simple terms, he believes the United States protects NATO countries. We don't get anything out of it in America, and the Europeans don't pay for it. So, what good is the alliance to us? He just doesn't understand that the U.S. is more secure if its allies in Europe are secure and there's peace and stability on the continent, which is obviously disrupted when Russia invades a country like Ukraine. Now, people have said, well, this is just a bargaining position. He wanted the Europeans who are members of NATO to adhere to the commitments they made in 2014 to get their defense spending up to 2% of GDP by 2014, by 2024 rather. And some of them have increased their spending, partially because of Trump, partially because of what Russia's done in Ukraine. That's what caused that 2% commitment to be made in the first place. But now Trump says, well, I think NATO members should spend 5% of gross domestic product on the military. My own view is that's what the United States should spend. We're at about 3% now. But I think in the world of challenges that we face, increased defense spending, as in Ronald Reagan's time, is what we need to do. So if the U.S. went to 5%, hypothetically, It wouldn't surprise me at all if Trump thought 5% applied to the Europeans. So after many of them have strained, like Germany, strained to get to 2%, to be told now you've got to do even more than that shows that Trump it really is not serious about NATO. He knows it must be hard for people to more than double their defense spending in a short period of time. And however much on the merits, frankly, more Europeans should be spending more, just as the US has to spend more. Trump has created another excuse for America to withdraw from NATO. And if at some point he decided to go ahead and withdraw, he would simply use that as one more reason why NATO had failed.
Do you think it's realistic for the European countries to spend 5% of the GDP? Because a lot of the countries in European Union, European countries, they don't want to spend even 2% of GDP. So maybe how to say, maybe the cooperation with the United States of America is the more realistic way to be more secure, because without United States of America, even 5% of the GDP of the smallest state like Baltic states, it's really nothing to context it with the Russian spending to the war, because that's billions of dollars, billions of euros getting from the European states, from Western states to Russia, nevertheless, because the sanctions does not work in 100%.
Right. Well, I think when Trump talks about NATO members spending at 5%, it may be purely a pretext. It's one more excuse he can now use to say the U.S. spends all this money defending these people, and they won't spend enough on their own behalf. And if the U.S. withdrew from NATO, I mean, basically that's the end of the alliance as a functional matter. And the Russians know that. And so I think Putin is going to do everything he can not to get crosswise with Trump on negotiations over Ukraine. And I think he will find other ways to try to make Trump personally happy that they're talking and meeting again, and encourage Trump in ways that will have a negative effect on NATO and certainly on the war in Ukraine.
And do you imagine any scenario for end of this war that would involve NATO troops, NATO soldiers on the Ukrainian soil?
Well, as Trump is president, I'm very skeptical he would agree to a NATO security guarantee. He would not agree to put American troops on that ceasefire line. I think he'd object to NATO doing it. Uh, it would be inconsistent with what he said on so many other things, which is why the critical issue of what security guarantees there would be for Ukraine if a ceasefire were agreed to with Russia is very dangerous. This is because without the U.S. involved, I think Ukraine remains very exposed.
So the last week, President Zelensky mentioned that Ukraine will need 200,000 of troops, like the peacekeepers, if the number of the Ukrainian army will reduce after the war. And what do you think about the international peacekeepers troops on the territory of Ukraine? Can this be the soldiers from the NATO state countries, or it should be an international mission under the United Nation?
Well, I think Ukraine's got to be very careful about anything like this in a negotiation. The idea that the peacekeepers would only be on the Ukraine side of the line would be a huge mistake. They should have full access to all the territory that's part of the state of Ukraine, as agreed to in the Belavazia Agreement when the Soviet Union broke up. Because peacekeepers have a way of becoming part of the problem, and in the UN context, that where there's a division, the division becomes permanent, and I think that would be very unwise for Ukraine to agree to. But it's also important for people to understand what they mean when they say peacekeepers, and there's no clarity on that. In most uh, UN peacekeeping forces, the rules of engagement for the peacekeepers are that they are only permitted to use force in their own self defense. In other words, they're not there to enforce a ceasefire. They're there primarily to separate the parties and observe the ceasefire. In that sense, it wouldn't make any difference whether they were NATO troops or UN peacekeepers. They're not going to do anything to prevent a further Russia attack. If at some point in 5 years, Putin rebuilds the Russian army and he's ready to launch the invasion for the third time, UN style peacekeepers would not stop it. And so the question for NATO peacekeepers is whether the NATO contributing countries would be willing to have rules of engagement that they would oppose with military force any breach of the ceasefire. That would be a radical step in UN peacekeeping operations, and it's not something NATO has ever done, to my knowledge. So when people talk about NATO peacekeepers, it's critical to ask what are their rules of engagement? When are they authorized to use force? Because if they're going to be as weak as UN peacekeepers are, I'm not sure that Ukraine is any better off with the NATO force than with the UN force. And if the rules of engagement are that the NATO peacekeepers could fight the Russians if they violated the ceasefire, which wouldn't bother me, but you'd have to ask how many NATO countries would contribute troops under those circumstances.
No, without any doubts, British forces, because they express their willingness to support Ukraine, and maybe Polish forces, maybe not all the NATO countries, because you know that it's a lot of rumors that Slovakia, for example, or Hungary, they do not support Ukraine anymore. In any case, but nevertheless, let me turn to the sanctions, because in 2022 there were many voices that sanctions would destroy Russian economy in 1 year, in 2 years, in several months. But from the perspective on 2025, what do you think? Could the European and American politics improve new sanctions to make Russia suffer more, or do you think that the sanctions does not work at all? Because we can see that Russian could use a lot of the weapons made from the Western spare parts and use the Western technology, and this supply from Western countries unfortunately do not cut.
Yeah. Well, the sanctions are not well enforced. This is a general problem with many economic sanctions. Even the United States doesn't enforce as effectively as we should the sanctions we impose, and the European Union hardly enforces sanctions at all. The biggest mistake, though, was the kinds of sanctions put on Russian oil sales, because the Biden administration and I think many European countries were worried that if they imposed a strict cutoff of any sales of Russian oil or gas, that it would increase the global price and therefore, in the United States case, increase the price of gasoline at the pump, which Biden didn't want going into a tough election year. Well, if you want sanctions, you have to be prepared to bear the collateral consequences of sanctions. But the oil sanctions regime in place against Russia now allows them to sell enough on global markets to avoid causing a scarcity that would mean oil prices would rise, but not enough to be able to really have a severe economic impact on Russia. Russia can still sell oil, although below global market prices, still well above its cost of production. It's still earning money that it uses to fight the war. So this is an example of trying to do two different things with sanctions and not really accomplishing either objective satisfactorily.
Yeah, so it's very complicated situation, but nevertheless, maybe we return back to the American aid, and maybe my last question. Let's think about the future. So American aid to Ukraine reduced or stopped, and could it lead to the situation what was in Afghanistan in 2021, when American forces just left this state, and after several weeks, after the several days, this state became completely, that flooded by the rebellions, and that Ukraine and Afghanistan, there are very, very different cases, but that American image in the world could be dropped down by this situation in Ukraine, because if Ukraine lose this war to the Russia, it means that United States of America and NATO cannot control this situation in Europe and worldwide.
Well, I agree. I think it's a big mistake to cut off aid to Ukraine. It was a big mistake to withdraw from Afghanistan. And remember, it wasn't Biden's responsibility in a sense. He said he was carrying out the agreement Trump made. Now, Biden could have rejected the agreement. He should have rejected the agreement, and the withdrawal itself was carried out badly. But it was the same objective that Donald Trump wanted. That's why he made a deal with the Taliban, which is perfectly predictable. The Taliban didn't live up to it, but both Trump and Biden wanted out of Afghanistan, and that's what they did. And I think it had very negative consequences. I don't think Trump wants to uh, look like he caved into Russia. I don't think that's the way this would transpire. But the threat that was part of the article that Keith Kellogg wrote was, if Ukraine doesn't negotiate seriously, then we cut off aid. The other side of it is, if Russia didn't negotiate seriously, the sanctions would be increased, but so would assistance to Ukraine. It's in Trump's mind, all these things are fungible. Ukraine, Russia, one side, the other side. He wants a deal. And the terms of the deal, I'm worried, don't matter to him, which I think could work to Ukraine's disadvantage. So it's very important to keep talking to members of Congress who support the aid to Ukraine, to engage with Secretary of State Rubio, with Michael Waltz, the National Security Advisor, and others, to make the case that that a Russian victory in Ukraine, which is what a forced settlement would look like, ultimately are very negative for the United States and for Donald Trump. Certainly negative for Ukraine, but it's important to make the case that Trump himself would look bad if he agreed to a settlement that basically allowed Russia to keep the fruits of its unprovoked aggression.
So do you have some good signals or some voices to support Ukraine from the Republican side of Congress or Senate?
Well, I think there are many Republicans who strongly support aid to Ukraine, and I think it's important to stay in touch with them. It should not be a partisan issue, but some Republicans are intimidated by Trump. They're worried that he would support opponents against them in primary elections. But especially in the Senate, I think the overwhelming majority still strongly supports aid to Ukraine. And in both houses taking all the membership together, I think there's strong support for continuing aid to Ukraine. So the mission of the Ukrainian embassy here has to be to stay in touch with those people, bring members of Congress to Ukraine, extend the invitation to both Trump and Vance to come to Ukraine and see things firsthand. I think uh, that's important. I don't know whether it will happen, but I think it's important at a minimum that Secretary of State Rubio go there as soon as he can. He's going to Latin America this weekend. That's his first overseas trip. But Ukraine should try and make Ukraine his second destination.
Yeah, thank you very much. And maybe the very last question is not about the analysis, but your feeling. Do you think that this war could be ended this year, 2025?
Well, only if on a Saturday you can end any war very quickly by agreeing to what your opponent wants, and that would be a huge mistake for Ukraine, even if it comes under enormous pressure. Uh, Vladimir Putin and many Russians have made it clear they want the Russian Empire back, and that means they want Ukraine back. So, an independent Ukraine, which Boris Yeltsin agreed to at Belavesia, is something that Putin and many others want to reverse. And if he thinks he can get that, he's prepared to use force again. So, if Ukraine doesn't want that as a possible future, then it shouldn't agree to terms which leave it vulnerable, which I think would mean that it would take a long time to reach agreement with Russia, as long as the Russians want the exact opposite of that.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time and for the answering my questions. And I hope we will see you again.
Well, thanks for having me, and glad to do it. So stay in touch.